Great to see everyone this morning, and I want to join with what others have already said in wishing all of our mothers a happy Mother's Day. It is a wonderful thing to celebrate our mothers for the people they are and for all the things that they do, and I'm grateful that our country wants to set aside a day to do that. And as Jarrett said at the last hour, it can be a bittersweet day. I have some of those feelings myself. My mother no longer remembers me, but I remember her, and I remember all the acts of love and kindness and sacrifice that she made on my behalf throughout her life, and most importantly, God remembers all of them as well. And one day, all of her memories that have faded will be restored, and we will have great joy in the presence of the Father. And every hurt that we experience in this world and sorrow that we suffer is going to be made right. And I hope that you never lose that hope. It's a terrible thing to try to live in this world without hope. But we have great hope in our Lord Jesus Christ. Well, in addition to the many, many good news things that Scott had to share with us, I have one more bit of good news before we launch into today's sermon. Clint Stinson is going to be working with us for the 12 weeks of his summer break as an intern here, preacher in training. And he is between his sophomore and junior years at FC. He'll be returning there in the fall, but we are really excited. We've already spent 1 week working with him, and he's just soaking it up, and we are grateful for his heart and for the desire that he has to increase his abilities to be a minister of God's Word and His grace to others. So please encourage Clint. He's one of our own, and we're just so grateful for him. Well, we're in a series of lessons, right in the middle of a series of lessons on the Sermon on the Mount that we've called the narrow path. It's a narrow path that leads into the expansive life in the kingdom of heaven. A kingdom of heaven that's not something that we're just waiting on to inhabit in the future, but it's God's ways and God's will coming down and taking root in our lives, in our hearts, and being manifest in our world, even now as it is in heaven. And as we finish up this part of the sermon in chapter 5, we see Jesus is drawing a sharp contrast between two different kinds of righteousness, or two different ways of trying to justify oneself or be found right in the sight of God. He puts it this way in chapter 5, verse 20, which really sets up a series of contrasts that we're working through right now. He says, speaking to his disciples, unless your righteousness goes beyond that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. You'll never know what it's like to experience this expansive life, this broad and joyous and full life in the kingdom of heaven, as long as you are trying to be right or justify yourself in the way that the scribes and Pharisees are going about this. One of my great concerns is that many, many Christians today are still trying, maybe sincerely so, but still trying to be righteous or justified in the sight of God in the same way that the scribes and the Pharisees were trying to do so. And we must get beyond that. We'll never experience this expansive kingdom here or later until we learn to receive the love of our Father in heaven in such a manner that it changes and reorients the way that we treat other people and see ourselves and experience the joy and the fulfillment that comes from dwelling in His kingdom. Now, we've already seen the difference in this way of justifying ourselves or being righteous in God's sight through a series of contrasts. First, in regards to our anger, how we manage and deal with our anger. The way the Pharisees did that and the way Jesus teaches us are two totally different ways. And the same with trying to deal with our desires of lust and how they show themselves in the way we divorce our wives or husbands when we grow weary of them, or the way that we are not keeping our promises when something else that we want shows up. Jesus says there's two very different ways of trying to work through that. We've seen that in the two previous lessons. But today, we're going to see that in all of this, we see that the righteousness of the Pharisees is something that we might call external and legal. They would ask the question, what must I do or perhaps not do in order to be justified before God? It's not perhaps a bad question, but it's an incomplete question. And Jesus wants us to go deeper. And so in the righteousness of the kingdom that Jesus is leading us into has to do with internal transformation of character, not just external observation of the rules. And the question that we need to ask in order to achieve the righteousness that God desires is, who must I become to live this kind of life? Not just what must I do or not do in order to be justified, but what kind of person, who must I become in order to freely and genuinely and truly live the kind of life that the law was always pointing to. And so today we come to a contrast between the way the Pharisees taught their disciples to react to the insults, the injuries that one might receive from their enemies, and the way that Jesus teaches us as his disciples to respond to insults and injuries that may come from our enemies. And I want you to notice I used a little bit of a different word in each of those, and I'm going to do this a number of times throughout the course of the lesson. The way that the Pharisees reacted to insults and injuries, and the way that disciples are to respond to insults and injuries. We're not to react to the behaviors of others toward us, but we're to respond to them out of the generous resources that we now have as inhabitants of the kingdom of heaven. Two very different things. So in Matthew 5 and verse 38, Jesus makes the fifth of these contrasts between the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees and the righteousness that we're to exhibit. He says, you've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. This is the lex talionis, the law of retaliation. It's stated 3 times in the Old Testament and is generally this day misunderstood. It was intended to accomplish 2 things. Number 1, it was always given in a legal context. That means that it was given to provide judicial guidance to judges and authorities in their efforts to administer justice. It was never given to authorize individual or vigilante justice. And secondly, it was given in order to prevent excessive retaliation. In other words, an eye for an eye meant that the punishment must fit the crime. Because in our human nature, in our flesh, what we want to do is when you injure me, I want to not get even, I want to get ahead. You take out one eye, I want to take out 2 eyes. You break my finger, I want to break your arm. You take something from me, I'm going to take more from you. And so this lex talionis, this eye for an eye, was given for judges to use in governing their people so that the punishments that were delivered were in accordance with the crime that had been committed. So it was intended to prevent the escalation of violence. But it would seem from what Jesus says here that the Pharisees were interpreting this as permission to get revenge for personal insults and injuries. At least that was the way it was being popularly used in Jesus' day. And isn't it true that you still hear people using it that way? Eye for an eye. You did it to me. Bible says eye for an eye. Now I get to exact my pound of flesh in response to or in retaliation to the injury that I just received or the insult that I just received from you. But that's not that's not the righteousness that we must have or seek in order to experience God's rule and reign, His kingdom in our life. And so in Matthew 5 and verse 39, Jesus says, in contrast to what you have been told, I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. Perhaps could be better translated, do not retaliate against the one who is evil. Now, many take this as an absolute law, and it's a mistake to do so. Christians, and woodenly applied, Christians who do this take a position of absolute pacifism, that you must never in any case respond or oppose an evil person in any way. You must not therefore go to war. You must not exercise self-defense. If you are subject to domestic abuse, you just have to take it. Some even have gone so far as to say it's wrong, it's a violation of Jesus' commandment to put a lock on your door because that would be resisting an evil person. But that's absurd. Unbelievers interpreting it the same way, like Marx and Nietzsche, say that it is absurd, it's impractical, and it's a slave morality. But the words of Jesus must be interpreted in a way that is consistent with the actions of Jesus. The words of Jesus must be interpreted consistently with the actions of Jesus. And Jesus' entire ministry was one of resisting evil. I won't take the time to read the whole thing. I couldn't see it if I wanted to. But Henry Fosdick, the early 20th century preacher, said that if that's what Jesus means, then it's a miracle that one who was such a milquetoast could have ever gotten himself crucified. But the fact of the matter is that Jesus inspired such loyalty in his followers that they would be willing to die for him, and such violent opposition in his enemies that they could not rest until they killed him. He drove out money changers in the temple, turning over their tables and driving them out with a scourge that he had made. He cast out demons. He gave withering rebukes to the Pharisees for their hypocrisy. And so as we interpret the words of Jesus, we must do so in light of the actions of Jesus, and they must be reconciled. And so if Jesus is not telling us to be doormats, we have to ask the question, what is he teaching us to do? And I believe the answer to that is he's simply telling us this: do not react, there's our word again, do not react like the scribes and Pharisees. Do not react in such a way that the evil in others produces evil in you. Do not react to the evil in others in such a way that you mirror the evil in them. And isn't that the easiest thing to do? You'll see this happen everywhere all the time. You see it in the political arena, you see it in the religious arena, and you see it in people's everyday actions in life. Somebody does something, and it provokes a response in their opponents that mirrors what they did. And in doing so, you're falling into a trap. You're allowing your actions to be determined by the actions of your enemy. And we better be careful who we choose for our enemies, because if we interact with them on that basis, over time, we're going to become a mirror image of our enemies. And it happens over and over and over again. And it's the easiest trap ever to fall into. But Jesus wants his followers to be free from that, to follow a narrow path that leads us into a much broader variety of responses, rather than just the fleshly reaction that allows the evil in others to become the evil in us. So we must not allow the ill will in our opponents to displace the goodwill in our hearts. And then Jesus brilliantly lays out 4 illustrations of how a kingdom-minded person might respond to a wide variety of injuries, insults, and difficulties. Now again, these are not laws. I'm going to repeat that, and I hope to prove that as we work our way through them. They are creative and godly alternatives to the worldly minded way of reacting. Let me say that again. Jesus gives us a series of creative and godly responses that a kingdom-minded person might have as available options to him, as opposed to the prevailing attitudes and actions and reactions in the world we inhabit. So if you take them as laws, you're going to run into a problem very quickly. Two problems, really. First, you're going to find yourself insulted or injured in a way that is not exactly like one of the four ways that Jesus mentions, and you're not going to know what to do. I don't have a law for this. Or secondly, you're going to find yourself insulted or injured in the ways that Jesus describes, and you're going to have to do what he says because that was the law that Jesus gave us, and you may approach it with anger and hostility in your heart. But I'm going to do what Jesus, I'm going to walk this second mile, and I'm going to be angry every step that I take. And in doing so, you will have attained the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. You'll have done what Jesus said, and you'll be no different than the people that he's trying to get us to be different from or see a better way than. If you receive these as illustrations of how a person living under the loving care of his heavenly Father might respond to a variety of personal insults, interruptions, injuries, and offenses, then you will find them to be ways that free you from the trap of the prevailing assumptions of our world, like retaliation, violence, and greed. So with that in mind, let's look at these four illustrations that Jesus gives us. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. If anyone would sue you and take your tunic, give him also your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. All right, well, let's look at these quickly, each in order. First of all, the backhanded slap or insult. People have made the point that most people are right-handed, and so if you get slapped on the right cheek, the only way for a right-handed person to do that is to give you a backhanded slap. He's not talking about someone is coming up and they're going to beat you to death, and you just stand there and take it. But he's talking about a person has slapped you, insulted you. What is your natural response to that? Eye for an eye. Get ready, buddy. It's coming back your way. That's our natural response. This is the Pharisaical response. And in doing so, we think that we are justified in retaliating. But what alternative do I have if my sense of dignity and self-worth isn't based on the praise or insults of evil people? How might I respond to this if the frame that I'm living in is the frame of the kingdom of heaven, and I live under the approval and love of a Father who sees all that's taking place, who will deal justly with every offense that is given, and who wants me to love others in the way that he has loved me? What options might I have available to me other than just getting even? Well, according to what Jesus says, I might stand my ground. Look him in the eye, but not retaliate. It's very important to notice, unlike what Nietzsche might think, Jesus is not teaching us here that you run away in fear from a bully. You stand there and you look at him again, you slap me, you're trying to diminish my personhood. And I'm just going to look at you and say, well, here I am. I'm still a human being, still standing in front of you. What are you going to do? And I'm not going to hit you back. And hitting back, that's what he's expecting you to do, or to say something back. And in doing so, he will feel more justified in what he's done because, look, you're no different than I am. Tit for tat, you do what I do. But instead, we look them in the eye, we stand our ground, and we assert our humanity. And we also recognize theirs as well by refusing to allow their evil, the evil in them, to become the evil in us. And I'm refusing to let that evil person dictate my response. Now, this is unnerving to the other person. They expected a reaction, and now they're kind of nonplussed as to what to do. He goes on and he talks about someone suing you for your tunic. Israelites dressed in two layers. They had a tunic as an inner layer and a cloak as the outer layer. And so maybe you go to court, and this is probably not, again, he's not even giving like a realistic scenario, but you're in a court of law and somebody wants to sue you and take one of your layers of clothing. And in our flesh, in our worldly attitude, what do we want to do? Hey, they're suing me for my cloak. I want to countersue for their cloak, okay? Well, what alternatives might be available to the person, again, living in the kingdom of God? Instead of seeking to get even, he again might do something creative, something that causes the other person to come to grips with the reality of what they're doing. You're trying to reduce me to nothing. So I'll tell you what, let's do this. Since you want to take my outer garment, let me just give you my inner garment as well. Now, in the ancient world, I'm told, unlike ours, nakedness, when we see nakedness, our greatest association of shame with nakedness is someone seeing us. Like, oh, you saw me naked, you know. But for them, the greater shame was associated with seeing someone naked. Oh no, I saw a naked person. So the shame would associate with that. And so you've taken my cloak. Okay, well, here, you just take everything. And now they're ashamed of what they're doing. They realize, I'm trying to take this person's livelihood. I'm trying to take this person's protection, this person's covering. And it's a person that I'm dealing with. And since they didn't retaliate in kind, but actually offered to even go further, I'm now kind of having to rethink this. Going the extra mile, the Roman occupation of Israel was something that the people of Israel hated. And one of the things they hated most was a rule that a Roman soldier could compel any male Israelite to carry his load, to carry his equipment for up to 1 mile. And you can just imagine how that would feel and what that would look like. You're busy, you've got your own activities, you're late for an appointment, and all of a sudden this Roman soldier appears out of nowhere and he's like, hey, takes off his pack and says, let's go 1 mile, you got to carry my stuff. And you're just like so upset and so angry. And the Romans, of all people, were to the Jews the enemy. And having to do this was just humiliating to them. And so I would sure in many cases they did this just mumbling under their breath the whole way. But Jesus again says, now you've got options. Now that you live under the expansive domain of heaven, and the Father's love has filled your heart, and you see how many extra miles Jesus has traveled in order to meet you where you are and carry your load as far as it needs to be carried. What creative response might you have to this situation? Maybe instead of complaining when this young soldier, most of the soldiers were just in Israel, were just teenage boys that had been taken from Syria to function in this capacity. And so maybe you say, sure, I'll go this mile with you, and you start carrying his load along the way, and you say, hey, well, where are you from? Do you have a family? Hey, what's the hardest part of your job? I know you've got a hard job. This is a difficult job, and I'm glad I can carry that. Hey, we just passed the mile marker, but we're having such a good conversation. Let's just keep going. I'll walk with you another mile. And by the way, there's somebody I wanted to tell you about. And it's the reason why I kind of have an unusual attitude towards you about this. I'm pretty positive about it because I want to tell you about somebody who came and walked an extra mile with me and carried my load. And in fact, you might not only just go 1 extra mile. It's not a law. Jesus, again, is not giving us a law. You might go the extra mile and say, hey, I'll go a couple more miles with you. And so this is the attitude that Jesus is teaching us to have, and it's so revolutionary. We refuse to be framed and controlled by the behaviors of other people, but instead are framed and controlled by our life in the kingdom. Well, what about borrowing? Somebody comes and asks you for something, well, give it to them. And again, skeptics look at this and object, well, look, this is just enabling. What if he's a drug addict and he just keeps asking you for money, you just keep giving him money and he just completely goes and totally wrecks his life buying meth? Do you think Jesus didn't know that? Is Jesus that dumb? No, these are not laws, and he's not telling us to, under any and every circumstance, this is what you must always do. But he also knows that you and I often encounter people in life that need help. And our natural reaction is to say, mine's mine and I'm keeping it, and you deal and fend with life as best you can. And Jesus says, no, you live under the heaven, under a generous heaven and a caring and abundantly loving Father. And he'll take care of you. So if you run across somebody who needs something, well, you take care of them. Of course, using judgment and reason in doing so. And maybe this morning you know somebody who needs some time and attention. Somebody that needs some help with a task. Someone who seems to always be short a few bucks. And in your flesh, you just kind of want to avoid that person. And Jesus says, no, you don't have to avoid them. You live under an open sky and a generous God, and you don't have to live in anger, but you can give your time, you can give your attention, you can even give money and pay their utility bill. This is the kind of way I want you to live in my kingdom. And this is a completely different kind of righteousness than that of the scribes and the Pharisees. And it compels us to ask the question, what sort of person must I become in order to almost easily live out this kind of ethic? To respond to the needs of others out of the strength and resources of the kingdom of heaven rather than reacting out of the anger and stinginess of my flesh and this world's outlook. And then Jesus adds one more thing. I know you've heard that you should love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. Well, many of us this morning, hearing these words of Jesus, maybe feel pretty convicted. Maybe there was an incident at home this morning or last week between you and your husband or wife or kids or your siblings, your roommate. And one of them did something that kind of set you off. Maybe what they did wasn't right. Maybe there was a little bit of evil in them and what they did to you. And how did you respond to that situation? In too many cases, maybe in my own, I pushed back real quick. Got my back up. You slap me, I slap you. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Knew somebody who needed some help, but passed by on the other side. I lived like I'm living in this stingy world where it's a zero-sum game, and I've got to keep what's mine, got nothing to share, got to push back in order to show that I'm tough. And every response or reaction on my part is just a mirror image of whatever's done to me. And I think that this is freedom, but it's actually being enslaved and controlled by the behaviors, words, actions, insults, and injuries of others. But Jesus would lead us down a narrow path, because few people will go here, that leads us into an expansive world of possibilities. Creative responses that we might have that would show and reveal the generous love and care of our Father who's ruling and reigning in our life. How did you respond when your opportunity to do that came? Well, maybe you're here and you're not even a believer or follower of Jesus, and you're kind of like some of these skeptics of old and just saying, this whole ethic is just ridiculous, it's absurd, nobody can do that. Well, I would say to you that you're in good company. I'd say that because I can't see any evidence in my Bible that anybody listening to Jesus say these words in the Sermon on the Mount as he began his ministry took anything he said seriously. Even his disciples who were sitting at his feet heard the words that Jesus said, and they were taking their notes, and they were nodding their heads, and then they went away and ignored everything that he said. I don't see anything in my New Testament that indicates to me that any one of them really thought that what Jesus had to say was practical, applicable, meaningful, or that applied to them in any real way. Because not only did Jesus teach this at the beginning of his ministry, this was the seed of the kingdom. This is the message, scholars think, that Jesus was preaching everywhere he went. This is the good news of the kingdom. A way that you can live your life that's so different and as an alternative to the world. And he's preaching that, and they're listening to him preach it over and over and over again. And then at the end of his ministry, it says in Luke chapter 9 that the time came, the time approached for Jesus to be taken up to heaven. He's going to die on a cross, be put in the tomb, and raised again the third day. And the time had come, and he knew that the time had come. And so Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. Some translations say he set his face to go toward Jerusalem. And as he makes up his mind resolutely to go to Jerusalem, he's going to pass right through Samaria. He's not going to go around it like a lot of people do. He's going to walk right through Samaria, this place where their enemies lived. And he sent some messengers, it says, out ahead of him. Got to make plans. They didn't have hotels in those days, but we need a place to stay. We're going to need some food to eat. So you go ahead of me and tell them, there's 30 of us coming, or however many there were, and make things ready for us in this Samaritan village. And so they got there to get things ready for him, but the people there did not welcome him because he was headed for Jerusalem. It was Passover, and him going to Jerusalem for the Passover indicated, because of their religious differences, that Jesus was siding with the idea that the place of worship was at the temple in Jerusalem, not Mount Gerizim, and they didn't want anything to do with it. If he's gonna side with the Jews and he's going down to Jerusalem, you're not welcome here, Jesus. And that's an extreme thing, because hospitality meant everything to people in the ancient world. But they stiff-armed Jesus and said, keep on moving, you're not welcome here. Now there's a stimulus, there's an action, there's an evil action. And all the things that Jesus had been teaching for 3.5 years, that his disciples had been there note-taking and nodding their head about, is now having an opportunity to be applied. How are you going to respond to your enemies who've insulted you? Well, one of them, named James and his brother John, called the Sons of Thunder, they said, Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven to destroy them? Jesus, I got an idea. They've insulted you. I know exactly what we need to do. Let's just exercise some of that royal authority and power that you have, and let's turn this Samaritan village into a smoking crater. That'll teach them a lesson. Jesus said, no, John, we're not going to call down fire from heaven. Instead, he rebuked them. Then he told his disciples to, go on ahead to another village and we'll stay there. We're not going to return insult for injury. We're not going to go beyond the law of retaliation and do worse to them than what they've done to us, to teach them the lesson, to show them who we are. We're just going to pass on and go to the next village. And when they finally get to Jerusalem, the day comes that Jesus is betrayed, and they send soldiers, a detachment of soldiers out to arrest him, because they expected he would do what everybody else does in this world. They're going to rise up and they're going to fight when they come to take Jesus. And when they get there, one of them reaches out to take Jesus, and Peter's ready. Peter's got a sword, And he swings for the guy's head. The guy ducks just in time and he shaves off his ear. Don't touch Jesus, I'll kill you. You touch us, we're going to touch you back. For 3.5 years, Jesus has been teaching this. They've been taking notes. And at this point, Jesus has got to think, I must be the worst teacher that's ever lived. My students who've been with me hearing this every day for 3.5 years on my way to Jerusalem are trying to call down fire from heaven to destroy the Samaritans and take off the heads of those who are reaching out to touch me. And Jesus goes away with those who had come to take him, where he is falsely accused, slandered. Witnesses are bribed in order to come up with accusations against him. And finally, they have enough that they think they can take him to the Roman authorities, and he appears before Pilate. And Pilate begins curiously to ask Jesus a series of questions. Why do they hate you so much? What wrong have you done? And none of his questions are really good questions, and Jesus is just silent, not answering. And so Pilate says to him, do you refuse to speak to me? Do you know who I am? Don't you realize I have the power to free you or to crucify you? And Jesus answered, you would have no power over me if it were not given you from above. And there seems perhaps to be some double meaning here, and I think maybe at first Pilate thinks, oh, you're trying to minimize me. You're trying to say that I'm just a lackey of Rome, and without them I couldn't do anything. But as he thought about it, or maybe the way Jesus said it, he began to realize he's not talking about the emperor. He's not talking about Rome or the empire. He's talking about a power over me that's far, far greater than that. And Jesus is indicating that this power dynamic between me and Pilate he's couching that in a far, far greater framework than what I have imagined. And that maybe I don't have quite as much power over Jesus as I thought I did. And so finally, it says that from then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free. And in this context, John also tells us that Pilate became afraid or feared Jesus. He began to realize, I don't have as much power over the situation as I thought. And Jesus, by the way that he's responding to his enemies, and he's responding to me, and is speaking of this power that's greater than all, I'm kind of nervous about what's going on here. But because of the insistence of the Jews, Pilate handed him over to be crucified. And it wasn't until after Jesus died on the cross, was buried, and rose again that the words that the disciples had been taking all these notes on and shaking their heads to, all of a sudden when they saw him respond to his enemies the way that he did, even on the cross saying, Father, forgive them, they really don't even know what it is they're doing. And Father, I trust you, and into your hands I commit my spirit. All of a sudden, those words that Jesus had been pounding into their ears that could not seem to find lodging in their hearts began to germinate and make sense. And they began to put into practice the things that Jesus had taught and the way that Jesus had lived. So much so that years and years later, John, the son of thunder, who wanted to call down fire from heaven to destroy those who had insulted them, becomes known as the apostle of love. And Peter, who tried to take off the head of his enemies, wrote these words in 1 Peter 2:23. About Jesus, he said, when they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. And when he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges righteously. Isn't that amazing? All of those years of teaching that Jesus had done had finally sunk into Peter when he had saw that Jesus had died and risen again. All of a sudden, it's like, I think I'm going to take this seriously in a way that I never have before. And he commends to himself and to others the way of Jesus, the way of the kingdom in response to our enemies, calling upon us to imitate him. You know, if you choose to live in the kingdom of heaven where God is in control, when evil men assail you, you can look them in the eye and know something that they don't know. To pull a phrase from Jesus' dialogue with Pilate, you'll be able to look to them and say, you, not with malice, but just reframing the situation, you have no power over me. I know that you're wanting to control the situation and have me respond to you in the same kind of evil way that you have treated me, but you don't have the power to do that. Because I have entrusted myself into the one who judges righteously. I live in a different kingdom now. You know, we want to think that we'll be recognized as Jesus followers by the things that we believe. Nearly any website of any church you go to, one of the first things you'll see on their website is things we believe or what we believe. And we're just so convinced that if people just see what we believe, that's going to be the thing that compels them to become disciples of Jesus. But the reality is that they will recognize us as followers of Jesus by the way we respond and the way we live and the way we respond to evil in a manner that shows that we believe truly that the Father is in control, that we are in his hands, and we commit ourselves to him who judges justly. And so this week, you and I will have another opportunity, because as sure as last week, someone, a family friend, a neighbor, a coworker is going to insult you or ignore you or break their promise to you or gossip about you or injure you in some other way. And you will either react in anger and respond to them in like kind, or you will entrust yourself to him who judges justly. So in that moment, when you feel in the flesh that response of evil, that response of anger, that eye for an eye mentality rising up within you, pause long enough to say, I will not react in kind. And give them the power to control my response and set the terms of my response and allow the evil in them to become the evil in me and escalate the situation higher and higher. But instead, I will remember to commit myself into the hands of him who does justly and think, you have no power over me. This is my chance to manifest the kingdom of heaven right here in the middle of this broken world. And that would be a beautiful, beautiful thing. I want to close by reading you a shortened version of an email that was sent to a preacher in New York City a while back. Makes sense when you know a thing or two about the traffic in New York City, but here's the way it goes. It says, hey brothers, I just wanted to share something really unexpected that happened this week. I was in a car accident, everyone's fine, but it turned into something that more than I could have ever imagined. I was driving through a Jewish neighborhood in Brooklyn when I saw a car trying to back out of a driveway. Instead of being patient, I honked and sped by, being a total jerk, honestly. A minute later, we were both at a red light. And the same car pulls up beside me illegally into oncoming traffic and on a one-way street and tries to turn right in front of me and ends up crashing right into my car. We got out, and as you can imagine, it got heated fast. We both blamed each other, And a crowd started forming in front of a synagogue. It happened right in front of a synagogue. He said, I could feel the tension rising. It was like me against all of these Jews in the synagogue, and it felt like me against the whole block. But then out of nowhere, another Jewish driver came over and said, I saw the whole thing. It wasn't your fault. I'll be a witness if you need me. When the cops arrived, they agreed the other guy was in the wrong. And I was sitting in my car afterwards, about to drive away, angry and frustrated. And then I asked myself that dangerous question. What would Jesus do? And right there I felt conviction. James 1 flashed in my mind, be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. So I started praying. I prayed for the cop. I prayed for the guy who hit me, for everyone watching. And then I got out and walked up to the young guy who hit me and told him I was sorry that this whole thing had happened. And I said, look, even though the accident is technically your fault, truth is we were both driving offensively. We both let pride and frustration take over. The guy and I both confessed what we had done to each other and to God right there on the sidewalk outside a synagogue. I told him I wanted to show grace, so we agreed to skip the insurance fight, split the repair costs out of pocket, and go visit a few shops together. Afterwards, we even had lunch at a kosher place, and we shared our life stories. He told me how he had been homeless for a time, and a Christian had helped him off the streets when he was homeless. He said Christians have always been shown up in his life like a light. He's still firm in his Jewish faith, but I could tell you that Jesus showed up for him that day too. And so I'm asking you, would you pray for my new friend? Just thought, what an awesome and perfect illustration to the very principles that Jesus is trying to teach us. How different a reaction than what we typically have. But Jesus is wanting us to follow that narrow path that leads into a kingdom full of alternative options that would reflect the love of the Father into a broken, violent, greedy world, controlled by that frame. But as citizens of the kingdom, we don't have to live it in anymore. This is a kingdom that you can live in. You can actually live in it right now under the generous skies of heaven. Jesus offers it to you. And if this morning you want to come and claim him as your Lord and Savior, he will walk with you a second, a third, 100th mile, as long as it takes, carrying your burden until you are able to manifest with ease the kind of love that he teaches us to have, a righteousness completely different from that of the scribes and the Pharisees. If we can help you in any way respond to that by baptism, or if you just need the prayers of the church, whatever your need, well, let us know while we stand and while we sing.